There is a question that the old-timers in Harlan County still cannot agree on, even now, even with the evidence sitting right there in the deed records at the courthouse. The question is not whether Cora Pell did what she did. The evidence for that is plain. 700 acres of timberland, river bottom, and high meadow, all in her name, all purchased fair and legal over the course of 20 years, paid for in cash or cashier's check, never once borrowed against, never once encumbered by a lien. The question the old-timers cannot agree on is how she knew. How a woman who drove a 12-year-old truck with a cracked dashboard and sold cream and soft cheese out of a cooler at the Millhaven Depot 3 mornings a week could have known, with apparent certainty and well ahead of the rest of them, that the Aldercroft Timber Company was going to collapse, that the land would come loose in parcels, that each parcel would come loose in a particular sequence and at a price she could meet, and that the thing she was building with those parcels, one after another over 2 decades, would be not just a property, but a system, a living system, that would survive the worst drought the county had seen in 130 years, while every larger, louder, better-financed operation around her went to dust. The question is how she knew. This is the story of how she knew, and the answer, as with most answers that last, is older than she was. The thing to understand about Cora Pell is that she was not, by any visible measure, the kind of person a county associates with large plans. She was 51 years old when she purchased the first parcel, a narrow strip of second-growth hardwood along Anchor Creek, 11 acres, purchased from the estate of a man named Dolph Trant, whose heirs had already stripped what lumber they wanted and considered the remainder too swampy to farm. Cora paid $4,200 for it. She paid in a cashier's check drawn on an account at a small savings institution in the next town over, and the transaction was completed in the county recorder's office on a Tuesday afternoon. And nobody paid it much attention because Cora Pell was a woman who sold cream at the depot, and 11 swampy acres along a creek was not a large acquisition, and the year was, by the reckoning of the county, a year in which much larger things were happening. The Aldercroft Timber Company was expanding. They had hired 240 workers in the previous 18 months. They were building a second processing mill at the east end of the valley. They had a contract with a regional manufacturer that was, by every account, going to transform the economic life of Millhaven for a generation. Nobody was watching Cora Pell. Nobody was watching Anchor Creek. What they did not know, because she had not told them and did not intend to, was that she had been watching both for longer than they could imagine. She had been watching since she was 7 years old, sitting on the plank floor of her grandmother's kitchen in the early morning while her grandmother, a woman named Vera Pell, who had come to the county as a young bride and outlasted 3 droughts and 1 flood and 1 plague of beetles that took the county's chestnut stands in a single terrible autumn, read aloud from a ledger she kept in a tin box under the bed. The ledger was not a ledger in the conventional sense. It was a record, kept in a small, cramped hand of water. Where it came from, where it went, how it behaved in dry years and wet years, which slopes shed it and which slopes held it, which creek beds ran last when the summer came on hard, and which springs in the high ground never went silent no matter how long the rains held off. Vera Pell had kept this record for 43 years by the time Cora was old enough to sit beside her and listen. She had started it after the first drought, which had taken the family's first pasture and most of the kitchen garden and taught her, she said, that water is not a circumstance, it is a character, and a character has habits, and habits can be learned. The record was not scientific in any credentialed way. It was attentive. There is a difference. Attentiveness, held long enough and honestly enough, becomes something that credential cannot confer. The ledger said, in one of its early entries, that water pays its debts in its own season. That was the first time Cora heard the phrase. It would not be the last. When Vera died, she left Cora 2 things of note. The first was the tin box with the ledger inside it. The second was a piece of unmarked land on the upper slope above Anchor Creek, 12 acres of nothing much, rocky and steep, with a seep spring in the middle of it that ran through the driest summers Vera had ever recorded. Cora was 29 at the time of her grandmother's death. She was working at a dairy cooperative, had a small house in town, and had no immediate plan for 12 acres of rocky slope. But she read the ledger. She read it the way her grandmother had taught her to read it, slowly, with a topographic map beside her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, tracing the logic of what Vera had recorded against the lay of the land she knew from walking it since childhood. And she began to understand what her grandmother had understood, that the land in this valley was not arranged the way the county thought it was arranged. The county thought in terms of timber value, in terms of tillable acreage, in terms of road access and proximity to the mill. Vera had thought in terms of water, in terms of where it gathered and where it moved and where it could be kept, and by that accounting, the most valuable land in the county was not the flat bottomland near the road and not the thick timbered slopes above the mill. The most valuable land was a series of connected parcels running from the high meadow down through the second-growth hardwood along Anchor Creek and out through the river bottom to the south. Not because of what grew there now, but because of how water moved through it and how that water could be held and guided and made to persist through a long dry season. The land was a system waiting to be recognized. Cora had the key. She had had it since she was 7 years old, sitting on a plank floor listening to her grandmother read. She did not tell anyone this. She drove her truck. She tended her small dairy operation on the 12 inherited acres, selling cream and soft cheese at the Millhaven Depot on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, loading the cooler by lamplight, driving the 10 miles of county road in the pre-dawn dark, setting up her table with a handwritten price list and a cloth that her grandmother had hemmed. She was, to all appearances, a small-scale dairy producer of modest means and no particular ambition. This appearance was precisely accurate in every detail that did not matter, and completely false in the one detail that did. She was watching. She was watching the Aldercroft Timber Company the way her grandmother had watched the Springs. She had read the regional timber reports. She had read the soil surveys. She had read, in the County Historical Archive, the records of the 2 previous timber collapses in the valley, in 1902 and in 1947, and she had noted the interval and noted the conditions that preceded each one and noted the pattern of land release that followed. She knew, not with the certainty of a prediction, but with the attentiveness of a long reader, that the Aldercroft expansion was built on a premise that the soil and the water table of this particular valley could not sustain. She knew the second mill was premature. She knew the manufacturing contract was contingent on a softwood supply that would begin to thin in 7 to 10 years, given the current harvest rate. She did not know exactly when the company would fail, but she had enough of her grandmother's habit of mind to believe it would, and to believe that when it did, land would come loose, and she intended to be ready to meet it. She was not wealthy. She needed to save. She saved with a ferocity that was invisible because it wore the costume of simple frugality. She did not take vacations. She did not replace the truck. She ate from the garden and the dairy and the small flock of chickens she kept in a coop her grandmother had built. Every surplus dollar from the cream and the cheese went into the savings account at the small institution in the next town. It took her 8 years of this to accumulate the $4,200 for the Trant parcel. 8 years of early mornings and cold drives and setting up the table at the depot while the world around her was busy being impressed by Aldercroft's second mill. She was 51 years old when she wrote the check. She drove home from the recorder's office and walked the 11 acres in the late afternoon light, her boots going dark in the swampy margins of the creek, her hand trailing through the stands of young alder and ironwood. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way her grandmother had described feeling after she finished the first year of the water ledger, like she had finally begun. The first person to comment on the Trant purchase was a man named Roland Schuppe, who ran the county's largest agricultural supply operation and sat on the bank's loan committee and considered himself, not without some local agreement, to be the practical intelligence of Millhaven's business community. He drove out to Cora's place the week after the purchase was recorded, pulled up in a clean truck, and leaned against the fence post in the way of a man who does not expect to be long. He said that he had seen the filing at the courthouse and thought he would stop by, neighbor, to make sure she understood what she had bought. He said the trance strip was notoriously wet, and the timber on it was second growth and undersized, and that the creek flooded in spring, and that Dolph Trance Heirs had been trying to move it for 2 years, and she had likely paid more than it was worth. He said this with the warm concern of a man who believes he is doing a kindness, and perhaps he did believe that. Cora listened to all of it. She was pulling the handle of a post-hole digger when he arrived, and she kept her hands on it while he spoke. When he finished, she said she appreciated him coming by. That was all she said. He waited a moment to see if she would add to it. She did not. He drove away. She went back to digging. She had 47 post holes to finish before the weekend. The post holes were for the first of what would become, over the following 2 decades, a network of low earthen berms and shallow retention channels running along the contour lines of the 11 Trant acres, designed to slow the movement of water off the slope and into the creek during the spring melt, holding it longer in the swampy margins, reducing the velocity of the flood pulse, and extending the period of soil moisture through the summer. The design was not her invention. It was in the ledger. Vera had sketched the principle of it in an entry from 1961 after observing how a collapsed beaver dam on the upper creek had changed the flood behavior downstream, and she had written beside the sketch that a landscape that holds its water holds its life, and a landscape that loses its water loses everything else in time. Cora had read that entry many times. She was about to begin testing it at scale. The work was not small. The berms had to be built by hand with a rented walk-behind earth mover and finished with a flat spade, and each one had to follow the contour exactly or it would breach in the first heavy rain, and the channels had to be graded to carry excess water to the retention margins without eroding the slope. She worked 5 days a week on it through the fall and the following spring, rising before 4 to finish the dairy work and then driving out to the trance strip and working until the light failed. Her neighbor's son, a quiet 16-year-old named August Rain, who helped with fence repair along the road, came by one afternoon in October and watched her for a while without saying anything. Then he asked what she was building. She said, "Something that holds." He thought about that. The following Saturday, he came back with a spade and asked where she wanted him to start. She showed him. They worked for 4 hours without speaking except to confirm measurements, and at the end of it he said he would come next Saturday too if she wanted. She said that would be useful. He came every Saturday for the next 3 years. He was the only one who did. The chorus of commentary from the rest of Millhaven developed its own rhythms over those first years, as the evidence of her work became visible to anyone who drove past the trance strip and looked. The smothering kindness came from the women at the depot, who understood that Cora had spent her savings on swamp and was building earthworks in it alone, and who brought her casseroles and offered their husbands help in the way of people who have concluded that a neighbor is grieving improperly and could be nudged back towards sense. Cora thanked them for the casseroles. She did not explain. The open disdain came from a man named Fletcher Carn, who owned 300 acres of prime timbered bottomland to the north and drove a new truck every 2 years and had a consulting forester and a line of credit at the regional bank that he described at the feed store as conservative leverage, which in his case meant he owed $140,000 on timberland that was performing well as long as Aldercroft kept buying. He said, at the feed store, that Cora Pell was doing the most expensive nothing he had ever watched anyone do to a piece of useless ground. He said this with the open good cheer of a man who has never been wrong in his own estimation, and the men around him laughed, and Cora, who was not at the feed store and would not have answered if she had been, kept building her berms. The second parcel came available in year 4, when a logging family named Ostergaard decided to sell the upper portion of their holding, 31 acres of mixed hardwood on the slope above the trance strip, to pay for equipment repairs. Cora had been watching for this parcel. It was the slope above her berms, the land the water crossed before it reached her channels, and without it, she had no control over what arrived at her margins. She paid $12,000 for it, a sum she had been accumulating for 2 years against this possibility, and the sale was quiet and fast and completed before anyone with a competing interest knew it was in motion. Roland Schuppe found out 3 weeks after the recording and came by again. He stood at the fence and said that $12,000 for hill slope hardwood in the current market was a price she would not recover in her lifetime, and that the Ostergaard upper was rocky and the timber was skinny, and he said it with the same warm concern as before, the concern of a man who has not yet considered that he might be the one missing something. Cora said she was not planning to recover it in timber. He waited for the explanation. She did not provide one. She went back to work. This is the nature of the long middle of any plan that is not understood by the people around it. It is invisible. The accumulation of advantage in a system is not visible to those who do not know what kind of system is being built. What the county saw over the next 12 years, as Cora purchased 5 more parcels in the sequence she had mapped from the ledger and her own observation, was a woman of modest means making peculiar real estate decisions. The parcels were not the parcels anyone else would have chosen. They were not the flat bottomland with road access. They were not the timbered slopes with extractable value. They were the swampy connector strips, the steep-sided draws, the spring-fed gullies, the high meadow above the watershed divide. The prices she paid were low because nobody else wanted them, and she paid them over 20 years in a patient procession that the recorder's office documented and almost nobody read. By the time she turned 65, she had acquired, in addition to the inherited 12 acres on the upper slope, 6 purchased parcels totaling 204 acres. By the time she turned 70, she had 9 parcels and 418 acres, and the Berman Channel system had been extended to cover the contours of 6 of them, and August Rain, who was now 35 and had finished a degree in watershed ecology and come back to Millhaven because there was no other place he wanted to be, was helping her manage it with the precision of a man who had spent half his life learning the formal vocabulary for what he had watched Cora do by instinct and inheritance. He called it passive water harvesting and infiltration-based drought buffering. She called it what her grandmother had called it, holding what comes. The thing about Aldercroft timber was that it did not fail quickly. It failed the way a large tree fails in drought, which is from the inside, slowly, invisibly to anyone not reading the rings, and then suddenly and completely. The softwood supply had begun to thin in year 11 of the expansion, exactly within the window Cora had estimated from the harvest rate she had tracked. The manufacturing contract had been renegotiated downward twice by year 14. The second mill had reduced its operating shifts in year 16 and closed entirely in year 18. By year 19, the company was in receivership, and the land it held, 648 acres of valley floor and mid-slope forest, was being parceled by a court-appointed administrator according to a liquidation schedule that Cora had, by that point, been watching for 3 years and positioning herself to meet. She purchased the remaining 4 parcels over the final 2 years of the 20-year sequence, paying prices that were low because the administrator needed to move land, and the market for timberland in a county where the timber company had just collapsed was not a strong one. She paid in cashier's checks from the same small savings institution. The total for all 712 acres, including the inherited 12, came to $311,400 over 20 years, an average of $15,570 per year, funded almost entirely by cream and cheese and the ferocious discipline of a woman who had decided at 51 that she was ready to begin. The summer of the drought, which arrived in the 21st year after the first purchase, was the kind of summer that the county would eventually stop describing in comparative terms and simply call the summer, the way communities eventually stop comparing a wound to previous wounds and just call it the wound. It came in after a dry winter and a rainless April and a May that gave the valley 2 inches and then closed like a fist. By June, the Millhaven Creek gauge at the highway bridge was reading the lowest level recorded in the station's history. By July, the gauge had dropped another 6 inches below that. Fletcher Carnes' bottomland pastures, which had been green and thick in spring on the strength of the winter's modest snowpack, had gone to pale straw. His cattle were on purchased hay by July 15th. His well pump was drawing from a depth that his driller told him, over the phone, in the flat voice of a man delivering a diagnosis, was not going to last through August if the rain did not come. It did not come. By August, the well was pulling sand with the water, which meant it was pulling from the bottom of a formation that was nearly spent, and his driller told him the next step was a new well at twice the depth and a cost that Fletcher had not anticipated, and that sat very badly against his line of credit, which he had drawn against heavily in the years of Aldercroft's decline, because the land value that had secured it had slipped considerably from its peak. He was a man who had never been wrong in his own estimation, and the summer was teaching him something new at considerable expense and with no sign of mercy. The day that August rain walked the full perimeter of Cora's 700 acres with a soil probe and a moisture meter and came back to the farmhouse porch with the readings written in a notebook, he did not say anything for a moment. He sat down on the step. He looked at the numbers. He said, in the measured voice of a trained person, confirming what he already knew but had not dared fully believe until the instrument agreed. The subsurface moisture across the infiltration zones is running at 62% of field capacity, in the middle of the worst drought in 130 years, on land that everyone else in the county has abandoned to dust. He looked up at Cora. She was pouring tea. She did not look surprised. She said the ledger had a note about the drought of 1934. She said her grandmother had written that the spring above the upper seep ran for 11 months of that year, without stopping. She said the berms were working the same way the beaver dam worked, holding the pulse, letting it sink. August looked at the numbers again, and then he looked at the high meadow through the porch screen, which was green, visibly, genuinely green, the kind of green that in August of that summer was not visible anywhere else in the county that he had driven through. He said quietly, like a man who has arrived somewhere after a long walk, "She knew." Cora handed him his tea. She said her grandmother knew. She said she had just been paying attention. What the drought revealed was not only what Cora had built, it revealed what everyone else had not built, and the contrast was stark in the way that only a true shortage can make contrasts stark, stripping away all the comfortable ambiguity that surplus allows. Fletcher Carn's 300 acres were producing nothing. His cattle were being sold at distressed prices to a feedlot buyer who was making a systematic tour of failed operations in a 3-county area. His line of credit was drawn to its limit. His well was at 70 feet and dropping. He had, in the reckoning of that summer, lost more than he had gained in 20 years of what he had called conservative leverage. Roland Shoup's agricultural supply business was in the strange position of being busy because people in a drought buy supplies, but the money they were spending was emergency money, borrowed money, and the mood at the counter was not the mood of a prosperous community investing in growth, but the mood of people trying to keep something alive that was already mostly gone. The county extension office put out an advisory about water conservation that arrived about 6 weeks after most people had already figured it out the hard way. The newspaper ran a story about the drought's impact with a photograph of cracked clay at the edge of the Millhaven Creek bed that people shared and grieved over. Nobody mentioned Anchor Creek, which was running low but running, fed by the lateral drainage from Cora's infiltration zones, a thin, steady thread of water in a county that had almost none. Fletcher Carn came to Cora's gate on a Thursday morning in the second week of August. He drove up in the new truck, which looked wrong against the backdrop of that summer, too clean, too certain. He sat in it for a moment before getting out. She was in the garden when he came through the gate, and she looked up and nodded, and kept working the row. He stood at the edge of the garden. He was a man who had always filled a room with the breadth of his certainty, and that morning he was visibly smaller, not in a broken way, but in the way of someone from whom a great weight has been removed, except the weight turns out to have been structural, and without it he did not know how to stand. He said that he had heard her well was still producing. She said it was. He said he had heard the creek was still running on her south margin. She said it was. He stood for a moment, and then he said, with the halting precision of a man paying a debt in a currency he is not accustomed to using, "I should have asked what you were building. I made up my mind about it without asking. That was not right." She stopped her weeding. She looked at him for a moment. She said it was a hard summer for everybody. He said it was particularly hard for people who had not prepared, and that was his own doing. She said she was going to put a water line from her retention pond to the fence line along the road, and she was going to open it to any livestock operation in the county that needed to draw from it, at no charge, through the end of the drought. He looked at her. He said that was a generous thing. She said it was practical. She said the water was there because the land held it, and the land didn't hold it for her. It held it because that was its nature, and it seemed right to let that nature extend a little further than her fence line. He didn't know what to say to that. He took off his hat. He put it back on. He said thank you. She went back to her row. He went back to his truck and drove away, and she did not watch him go. The line to the fence post at the road was open within the week. August rain ran the pipe and fitted the spigot and put up a small handwritten sign that said the water was free and the hours were sunrise to sunset. The first morning there were 7 trucks in the line before 8 o'clock. Within 3 days there were operations coming from the far end of the county, dairy farms and beef operations and 2 horse facilities, all of them with the same look of people who have driven a long way toward the only thing that can help them. Cora was not at the road to receive them. She let August manage the line and the pressure and the daily checks on the retention levels. She calculated that the pond and the lateral reserves could sustain the draw through the end of October if the rain came by then, and the weather records in the ledger suggested it usually did. She kept her calculations in a notebook she had started keeping in her grandmother's style. The same cramped hand, the same plain observation, the same dates and measurements and small marginal notes that were not conclusions but invitations to keep watching. Roland Schuppe came in the 3rd week of August. He came alone, which was unusual for him, and he did not pull up in front of the farmhouse. He stopped at the road line and waited in the queue with the other trucks, and when he got to the spigot, August recognized him and came over, and they spoke for a few minutes. August told her about it that evening. He said Schuppe had waited in line like everyone else and had not said who he was until he was at the front. He said Schuppe had drawn his water and then had asked if he could speak with Cora, and August had said he would pass the message. Cora thought about it. She drove down to the road the following morning and found him waiting at the fence line before the queue had formed. He was wearing work clothes instead of the pressed shirt he usually wore to his business, and he looked like a man who had spent the night practicing what he was going to say and still was not sure he had it right. He said he owed her an apology, which he then delivered in specific terms, item by item, the things he had said over the years, the words at the recorder's office and the fence post, and the conversations at the feed store where he had repeated things he should not have repeated. He said he had been wrong about the land and wrong about her and wrong in the way that is harder to excuse than ignorance because he had had access to the evidence if he had cared to read it. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said that he was welcome to the water the same as anyone, and that if he wanted to understand how the system worked, she would walk him through it when the summer was over, at no cost, and that the offer was open to any landowner in the county who wanted to learn it. He said he would take her up on that. He did. The following February, on a Saturday when the rain had come back, and the creek was full again, and the county was beginning to breathe, she held the first of what would become an annual walkthrough of the Pell water system. 14 people that first year, standing in the high meadow in rain gear, while she and August explained contour berming and passive infiltration and the logic of reading a watershed as a living thing with habits that could be understood if you were patient enough to observe them over time. She charged nothing for the walks. She handed out photocopied pages from the ledger at the end, the key entries, the ones about the drought of 1934 and the Beaver Dam and the nature of a slope that holds what falls on it instead of shedding it. At the bottom of the last page, she had written, in her grandmother's style, the single sentence that she felt contained the truth of the whole 20 years, the sentence she had been working toward since she was 7 years old, on a plank floor listening to an old woman read from a tin box ledger by the light of a kitchen window in the early morning. The sentence was this: water pays its debts in its own season. The walks continued for 11 years after that first February. The number of attendees grew to 40, then to 60, and in the later years to more than 100, People coming from 3 counties and occasionally from farther agricultural extension agents and conservation district officials and younger farmers who had heard about the Pell system the way people hear about things that work, by word of mouth carried on the quiet authority of demonstrated results. August Rain wrote a paper about the system for a regional hydrology journal, carefully crediting Vera Pell's ledger as the foundational source and Cora's 20-year acquisition and construction program as the implementation, and the paper was read and cited and made its way into the curriculum of an agricultural college 2 states away where it is still taught, attributed to V&C Pell, which is how Cora always insisted it be attributed, the two of them together, because she said she had not built anything her grandmother had not already understood. She lived to be 88. She did not sell the land. She gifted it, in a trust established 3 years before her death, to a land conservancy with the condition that the Berman Channel system be maintained in perpetuity and that the annual walkthrough continue for as long as there were people willing to come, and that the tin box with the ledger inside be kept in the county historical archive where anyone could read it. The trust document included, at Cora's insistence, a 1-page summary of the 43 years of Vera Pell's water observation, and at the bottom of that page, in the same cramped hand that Cora had learned as a child on the plank floor of her grandmother's kitchen, copied out by Cora herself in the year before she died, was the sentence that had been her compass and her inheritance, and her answer to every question the county had ever had about why she was doing what she was doing, in that swampy strip of alder and ironwood along Anchor Creek on all those long early mornings while the world around her was busy being impressed by other things. The sentence was this: water pays its debts in its own season. The sign above the archive shelf where the tin box sits reads the same. It has been there for 14 years. Nobody who has read the ledger has ever needed it explained.